So I know folks are still arriving, but I think we will begin. So thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to just give you a brief welcome before we get started. I'm Maya Elenevsky, the Events and Outreach Manager here at the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society with the Association for Contemplative Mind in Higher Education. The ACMHE is a multidisciplinary academic association with a membership of over 700 educators, staff, students, and researchers committed to the transformation of higher education through contemplative methods. The ACMHE is an initiative of the Center for Contemplative Mind in Society. I'd like to welcome you to our October 2020 Contemplative Education webinar, Critical Social Mindfulness, Foundations and Emergent Practices for a New Mindful Deal with David Forbes. David Forbes is an emeritus in the Urban Education Doctoral Program at the CUNY Graduate Center. He teaches and writes on critical and integral approaches to mindfulness in education and consults with the New York City schools on developing social mindfulness programs. He studied psychology at the University of Chicago and the New School and received his doctorate in counselor education from UC Berkeley. His latest book is Mindfulness and Its Discontents: Education, Self, and Social Transformation. He co-edited the Handbook of Mindfulness, Culture, Context, and Social Engagement with Ron Purser, with whom he co-produces the podcast, The Mindful Cranks. We are thrilled to be working with you today, David. And with that, I hand it off to you.
Wow. Thanks so much, Maya. Thank you. And thanks for everyone who's showing up in the Zoom room. And I want to especially thank Carrie Bergman for gently trying to get me to do this. We had to go through some times in the spring where we couldn't do it, but I'm very happy to be here. I wanted to thank Maya also for her excellent copy editing and technical support, which I'm going to need very shortly, I think. I have a lot of material here. And what I'm really big on is just the need to think about or rethink some things in the mindfulness field. And I really want to just encourage us as colleagues to think about these points. I have a lot of respect for other practitioners and writers, so I see this as really supplementing what many people are doing in their practice. I've worked with students and educators and counselors around some of these things, and I won't get to all of it. My slides are violate the rule of a simple slide. I jam-packed them too much, so I'm probably going to have to skip over things, but I will. The good news is I'm told that you all can have access to it later on, and some of it is in my book, and so it's a shameless plug for my book, which is it's also done by a very good Canadian press. For those of you interested in looking to find a place for your manuscript, it's called Fernwood. But the book, it's gluten-free and no animals were harmed, as far as I know, in the making of the book. Okay, what I usually do, I like to begin with this slide, and this is I exaggerate the contrast here, just to heighten the points. And the question that's always often underlying my work is mindfulness for adjustment or transformation. So as you can see on the left, there are kind of corporate types. They need to de-stress. Generally, we'll be talking about that a little bit. Mindfulness is often used to adjust and function a little better in a corporate setting. And the slide on the right is actually in Oakland. It's Occupy Wall Street back in 2011, but this was a demonstration in Oakland. So the point is to think about what is the context? What are the contexts in which we practice and both teach mindfulness? So I'm going to do three basic parts here. One will be the critique of traditional mindfulness, and some of it we'll be calling McMindfulness, which I'll be talking about. And the argument here is that it's inadvertently or unwittingly reinforcing individualism and neoliberalism. And again, I'll be talking a little bit about those terms. And then that's part one. And part two, I want to then pivot to foundations for a critical social mindfulness. I have a colleague and friend who's Barnaby Spring. He's the director of mindfulness and yoga in the New York City Department of Education. He appreciates my critique, and he's one of the people that tries to take it in. But he's always telling me to pivot more to more kind of well, I won't say positive. That has already a negative meaning. Positive has a negative meaning. Okay. But he's encouraging me to develop more programs. So that's what I've been doing. Now, although all my writings, I do that. Some people think I only do critique, and that's not true. So we're pivoting to a foundations for a critical social mindfulness. And the third part will be some suggesting some emergent directions for this kind of approach. So let's see, okay. So what I'm saying is that in many cases in mindfulness education, what's missing is a critical social, political, cultural, moral, and developmental context. And for the purposes here, we're going to call it the water. And what I'm going to do is just read this little story that comes from David Foster Wallace's commencement address at Kenyon College in 2005. And I've written about this in a couple of contexts. So the story is, there are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" So my theme here really is often in mindfulness, we're not looking at the water. What's the context? And things that we take for granted that are so implicit that we're just in it. So I'm arguing that much of mindfulness often misses the need to critically identify, question, transform, link with that water, with the social context. And again, as many of you know, that's a racist, gendered, capitalist, neoliberal structure of society. So let's look at the water if we can. It's not easy. You have to step outside of what we are swimming in. So one of the cultural notions here is the dominant myth of individualism. And that is linked with the structure and ideology of neoliberalism. So first of all, neoliberalism is the notion that the market, that you as a personal consumer can meet all your needs through the market. The market will solve all personal problems and needs, and that the individual alone is responsible for one's health and well-being through our personal private self-care by purchasing necessary items in the market. And this may sound familiar to you. I mean, the Republicans and the right wing have been pushing this for years. They want to privatize schools. They want to privatize healthcare. They want to privatize Social Security. And this is what's been going on. Those of you who work in higher ed know that things have become much more along the lines of a corporate or market ideology. And one of the consequences of this is this argument that Margaret Thatcher made in the 80s, along with Ronald Reagan, is that society doesn't really exist. That we're only just a bunch of individuals, aggregated individuals, and so the structure of society doesn't exist, and therefore racism doesn't exist. You will often hear this as a backlash from right-wing people too. Well, what's really structural racism? It's all just individual, personal issues. So this is still the dominant structure and ideology that we are swimming in. And the argument again is that you need to look within yourself for the source of your problems and for the solution to your stress and problems. So Foucault talks about governmentality. That is how policies, how we get governed in a very general way. And he's arguing that again, in this case, especially that individuals, and it's not the public space, it's not the state, that we are responsible for our own well-being and our needs through self-care and through the market. Some people talk about technologies of the self. which are means of governmentality. And so the next step in the argument is that mindfulness is often an example of a technology of the neoliberal self. It's a technology for which the neoliberal self can meet its own needs. That's a quote there from Krishnamurti. It's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. So again, we need to look at the society. So a number of people talk about McMindfulness. I write about it in my book. My colleague and friend Ron Purser, that's the title of his book, McMindfulness. And the idea here is that stress is a purely personal problem and a personal responsibility. And so what happens is that mindfulness becomes an ethically neutral technology, becomes severed from any ethical foundations. And John Kabat-Zinn declared that mindfulness is universal. That is, it's not beholden to any historical or cultural context. It's something that's just out there and accessible for everyone. And that leads to this issue that that mindfulness is not connected in any kind of explicit way of looking at a worldview. And the authority then shifts to science and into neuroscience, with looking at inside the brain, and a more biomedical framework. So that mindfulness becomes a very privatized do-it-yourself practice. All problems are psychologized. And what happens is society kind of fades into the background. It's become a psychotherapeutic approach. And again, the social context is mystified. And here's one of the things that kind of I find, I don't know, I don't want to say it bothers me, maybe it does. It's a little problematic when some people will say, if everyone just meditates, everything will be great. If everyone just meditates, society will change, institutions will change, structures will change. And to me, it's a little bit like they either never took Sociology 101, or maybe they were on their mobile phone in the back. I don't know. But the argument, again, it's missing a kind of analysis of larger society. And we have to take seriously the nature of how organizations and agencies and bureaucracies and structures are organized, and how we can try to change them. It's not simply a matter of each individual doing something. That's an argument. I mean, there's some people that will push back on that, but I will push back too. So in this way, we argue that mindfulness unwittingly, often, not intentionally always, reinforces and benefits a neoliberal society, a social structure that reinforces the kind of self-centeredness, individualistic, very privatized, consumerist society. Often it's alienating. People feel alienated. People have to compete with each other for basic human needs, and a whole litany of problems: racism, sexism, and so on. The other part of the McMindfulness critique is that mindfulness itself has become a profitable commodity. So just for example, Jack Kornfield and Tara Brach are now offering a 2-year teacher training certification program that you can become, by them, a mindfulness trainer. And how much does it cost? Well, it's kind of expensive, $6,700 tuition, not including lodging, meals, travel, and books. Okay, so the question you want to ask is, well, who is that aimed for? Who can pay for that? And you know, people are making some money from that. Again, the larger part of the McMindfulness critique is basically that it's used as an adjustment to corporatized work, and I'll get to school in a second. But in the workplace, then, mindfulness is a way to make individuals responsible for and adjust to their own stress. And basically, it's the way it's used. It does not address social and economic conditions of the workplace, which as many of us know, are very stressful. And that, again, has to do with the structure of the organization, the bureaucracy, and the agency. So often, corporate mindfulness programs assume the self-governing logic of neoliberal individual autonomy. I think that's a quote from James Reveley, who's from Australia. He's an educator there, and he has some very good critiques of mindfulness as neoliberal adjustment. So there's a parallel here in education, because the dominant notion from U.S. policy is also a kind of corporatized one, in that education is seen, and students are seen, as economic investments in the future. So we see that in government, even under the Obama administration, I would read policies that say, well, we need to help the U.S. compete globally, and that is the dominant education policy, that we need better education because we have to compete in the corporatized world. So what I'm asking for, what I think we need, is that we need to consider the cultural, social, and moral battle over neoliberal education reform. And what part do we all play? What part do we play? What can we play? What should we play? And you can see the meme is the notion of return on educational investment, which is part of that corporatized neoliberal policy practice. So there goes my arrow. Okay. So now we're gonna play around with some technology. I want to give a very powerful example of it's actually not two videos. It's really only one. There's another one that we won't be showing. But I want to do a shout out to Dr. Jennifer Cannon. She just recently successfully defended for her dissertation in the School of Ed at UMass. She is a longtime participant and activist in ACMHE. Did I get it right? ACMHE. And I'm grateful for a lot of work she's done. She's helped raise my consciousness about many things. But Ron and I published her article in our handbook on mindfulness, and so we're gonna look at a 1-minute trailer of a video put out by Mindful Schools in Oakland, and then we're going to try to figure out how to come back, and we'll go over her points. So let's try that. Let's see what happens. You're going to do that, Maya? You're going to, okay.
I don't know many likes you ugly at. No one likes you.
Bitch ass like Ruby.
Show my
What is going on?
Your backpack?
Connor's backpack.
Excuse me. Go sit in the back. Oh, I've given up.
We're that bad. They gotta bring a TV show about us.
I had a parent-teacher conference. The teachers were talking bad about me.
The principal said that if the teacher sent her to the office one more time, she have to change the school.
Sometimes I don't really listen.
Just a problem kid.
I really don't feel like my parents can understand me.
No, that's not. Yes, Mr. Emily.
I am here from Mindful Schools. We go into classrooms and teach something called mindfulness.
I was like, get out of here.
I don't know about the class.
People will like make fart noises and stuff.
Can I have everybody's eyes up here?
It's boring and it's stupid.
Keep your attention with me.
You gotta make stuff entertaining.
You will not be entertained 24 hours a day of your whole life.
Monica, go outside. I know you don't like expectations.
I do, but I don't like yours.
For him, that he has a chance and opportunity to be somebody here.
I want to prove to them that I'm changing my life.
Repeat silently in your mind, I wish for myself to be happy.
It's like something in your backpack, you know? It's always there. You can just pull it out and use it.
Okay. So I'm going to hit share screen. Is that it? Okay, share screen, share, and play. And we're going to hit play slideshow. Let's see. Are we back? Is that it?
Yep, perfect.
Oh, cool. Okay. So what Jennifer has said is written about. She sees this. This is only the trailer for the video. She sees a racialized discourse, which I don't think the people who did it do, and a deficit framework, right? There's something wrong with these kids. Out of control, inner city youth of color in trouble until this white mindfulness teacher comes and kind of saves them or rescues them. And basically, there's a hidden agenda here. It's not just a simple neutral practice. She's teaching them that hard work and effort and self-discipline through mindfulness will lead to success. And of course, one of the questions that I always have is, what is success? Who defines success? Is it the same for the kids as it is for the school? So the individual student is reformed and has to adjust to what the school says is valuable. They don't question the educational system or the society itself in larger terms. And Jennifer goes on to say there's no structural critique or critical exploration of students' lives or their social conditions. What's going on with them? And one of her points is that there's nothing that builds on the students' and community's own cultural capital or their own agency. And again, there's no critical analysis of the student's social context, why they're bored, or their own cultural capital in terms of even of contemplative practices. Now, why does my arrow keep disappearing here? There it is. Okay. So that's one example. Here's another example about high stakes tests that these mindfulness educators. Here's a quote from a student. Says, "Well, I'm taking a test. I get mad easily, and mindfulness helped me calm down. On the test, I got mad at some questions and got out of concentration. Focusing on my breath did get me back on track. I just let the monkeys go." And those of you, we meditate, we know what they talk about, the monkey mind. Your mind just jumps from one vine to the next. And so my question, look, the kids, yes, they sometimes they have to take tests, and this is one way to adjust to that. But I'm trying to broaden the lens here. And so I would hope that we would ask, why did the questions get him mad? What about the test itself, especially with high stakes tests? There's a lot of criticism of them. Diane Ravitch and Alfie Cohn and other educators are very critical of that. When is the student's anger about the questions and tests legitimate, and is it ever addressed? So those are questions that I think educators who do mindfulness need to look at. Here's an issue we're going to look at a little bit later around attention. And one thing I often hear from mindfulness educators is they say, well, we tell kids to pay attention 100 times a day, but we never teach them how. And that's a very seductive statement. It says, oh yeah, that's true. Let's teach them mindfulness. The how is supposed to be mindfulness, and it is a particular form of attention. But again, I'm broadening the lens. I'm asking, well, but why do we need to tell children to pay attention in school in the first place? If you look at the kids on the right, they're pretty good at paying attention to things they're interested in, and they can sustain their attention at times. So, do educators look at what is wrong with school itself, the curriculum, how it's taught, and also our own role in it? So we'll get to that in a little bit. This is a book. This is by Tish Jennings, who does some very good work with teachers in terms of getting them to focus on their own immediate feelings and mind while they're teaching. She has 2 books out since this one, actually. And what I want to do is broaden the lens here. The subtitle of this book, I think, could serve as a kind of neoliberal classroom mantra, which is peace and productivity in the classroom. Well, productivity again, there you go again. And so the teachers learn how to calm themselves, pay attention to thoughts and feelings in their students, and create a better managed or peaceful classroom. And those are I'm not knocking those. Those are important. What we still need beyond that is that what's ignored is that social problems that contribute to teacher stress, burnout, and demoralization are first translated into personal concerns that are simply in need of mindfulness. And second, this approach avoids external stressors, the discussion of external stressors and market approaches that contribute to teacher stress, demoralization, and attrition. There are many things that are happening in education. A few years ago, there were teacher strikes around the country, where teachers were finally fighting back against the conditions that were creating the stress, and why, and helped explain why so many teachers are leaving the field. So again, it's not simply internalizing and practicing and adjusting and being mindful. You have to look at what's happening in the context as well. Here's another program that I'm concerned about. This is Goldie Hawn's Mind Up program, and now this is part of a trend in mindfulness, which is she calls it brain-based learning, but there's a lot of emphasis again in terms of what we said earlier in terms of medicalization and neuroscience. So here's a quote from her. She says, well, we do a kind of brain break, which is sitting quietly and the focus is on the breathing, the students, and they listen to a sound, and that's just for a couple minutes, but what they understand is the neurological correlate. That's a big part of the program. And for her, she says, so that's contextual. That's contextual. And again, if you want to look at the neural correlates that are happening while we are doing things, that's one thing. But I would argue that that's not the most relevant or salient context. And what I think the emotional and social and political relationships and the dynamics in the child's life and in the classroom, those are the contexts to me that are most important, that contribute to why students may be alienated, or why they're stressed, and why they have difficulties in school. Another issue here, if you look at her poster, it says, well, you should brush your brain with meditation to build up, remove the buildup of fear and worry, which prevents you from experiencing the happiness you are seeking. Okay. There's another discussion that we all should have. I just learned this phrase. I think it's a good one, called toxic positivity. And so there's two questions here. One is, is there positivity at the expense of the full range of feelings, which, as many of you know, in mindfulness, you want to be able to be with and experience with all your feelings. And so, is there a kind of a bias, which I've seen around positivity, which again kind of blots out sometimes a full range of experiences, and also does not acknowledge the more social conditions that contribute to the way students and teachers feel. Here's our favorite person that we hope will be voted out in a few days. This is simply a feelings chart. I happen to use him here. I'm sorry I did. Now I have to look at his many faces again. But the point here is that feelings need to be put in social context. What I see a lot in this field is emotions are abstracted away from the actual everyday relationships and understanding of the context in which people live. And so you have feeling well, feeling bad, and feeling sad, okay. And mindfulness sometimes just says, well, okay, let's notice the feeling and maybe it'll go away and we can think of something more helpful. I like this quote from Paul Maloney. He's a British psychotherapist. And he says, in the end, it is you who are frightened and not your amygdala. The study of historical changes in emotional expression and understanding confirms that emotions are not just matters of biology, but are at least as much about relationships between people, their histories, and the differences in power that set the terms of mutual engagement. So I think that's a good counter narrative to the overemphasis that we often see on brain issues. There's a lot of problems with neuroscience that any activity makes changes in the brain. People will say, "Oh, mindfulness makes changes in the brain." Well, any focus or concentration, almost any activity of human activity makes changes in the brain. So it's very hard to find a one-on-one relationship. That's a whole other discussion. Okay, here I'm not going to go over these. This is just for your later perusal. My point here is that school mindfulness tends to ignore what people call malignant normalcy of neoliberal society. Here's a whole laundry list. We're not going to go over these. A lot of us are under stress from just being in a neoliberal society, if you add how we are under stress under COVID, that's double trouble. If you are African American or face other discrimination, that's even worse. That's even more. So, but just a few things like the myth of meritocracy. Simply, that that's part of the water. We don't question that in school. If you work hard, you're going to succeed. Well, we know that that's not true for many people, for many socially inequitable and structural reasons of structural barriers. Let's see, I will skip these. I want to get to the bottom and really say that a racist capitalist economy, I don't know if you can hear that helicopter here, Brooklyn, a racist capitalist economy that demands consistent growth, accumulation, consumption, competition, performance, privatization, productivity, and exploitation of the earth contributes to loneliness, self-blame, depression, and anxiety. So again, I'm arguing that there's a link here between society and the experiences that many of us are feeling. And yes, in terms of COVID that we're all going through, capitalism cannot solve the COVID pandemic because why? It's not profitable. And I think that's important. Okay, here's a summary of what I'm calling conventional mindfulness. Sometimes I call it mindfulness 1.0. And I'm not knocking a lot of this. I think that much of this is useful. I just think we need to go to mindfulness 2.0 or to what I'm calling critical social mindfulness. But here's some of the limitations of this approach that I see. It's individualistic and therapeutic. Problems are psychologized. They're seen mainly as residing within the person, which again reinforces the problems of neoliberal society. Tends to be technical and skill-based, not necessarily based on explicit moral foundations. It's unaware of many contexts, and it's often used in the service of adjusting students and teachers to school without questioning what are the values of what school is about in the first place, in terms of high-stakes testing, for example, and other sources of distraction and stress and lack of compassion. Okay, I think now I'm going to pivot. Yes, I pivot now. Okay, so now we're part 2. And here's some foundations for what I'm interested in. And now I wish that critical psychology was around when I was a grad student in psychology. It seems to still be kind of a marginalized approach, which some of us find surprising, unless you're a psychology major. It seems kind of self-evident. And there are people that are doing this, a couple in Britain, couple of people in Britain, Nicholas Rose and Ian Parker. My colleague at the CUNY Graduate Center, Michelle Fine, has a critical psychology subsection of the psychology doctorate. So they're very basic premises that really run counter to what traditional psychology has done and also to neoliberalism. Individuals are social and relational rather than private, self-contained, self-centered beings, which really is an operating paradigm in psych, at least when I studied it. Personal distress and all emotions are not, again, privatized matters. They're not strictly in your head, but they're aspects of troublesome social relations. So, for example, again, neoliberal competitiveness is often linked with depression and anxiety. The idea of a solid, unchanging self arguably is a social construct, which kind of aligns with a lot of what Buddhists say. And it's also critical of how practices of self-regulation developed by psychology help maintain power interests within neoliberal capitalism. So there's a movement of decolonizing psychology. On Facebook, there are a couple of groups. One is Mad in America, which is a very good anti-psychiatry group. There's a group called Occupy, which looks at critical psychology for decolonization. And there's also a group called critical psychology. So that's one of the foundations that I find refreshing and helpful. Another one that I'm personally interested in, I call it a prophetic critique. That I would argue that we need to look at moral foundations. Now, if you can find moral foundations that are as broad as possible, that reflect everyone in the world, that's what I'm for universal human rights, for optimal human development. in my particular case, I like East and West. You don't have to go this way at all. You can be an atheist, you can be a humanist, you can be interspiritual. These are just two that I suggest. I find them helpful. So I like what I find appealing about Buddhism is that the idea of letting go of attachment to one's ego. And that what that does is the more you can do that, the more you can take other people's perspectives and interconnect with all sentient beings, not just humans, but everyone. And there's a tradition in some schools of Buddhism about being a bodhisattva, which you're committed to ending suffering for all sentient beings, for everyone. I like combining that with Western Abrahamic prophetic traditions, which are Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Because what they do, they not only seek universal human rights and social justice for the oppressed, but to me they add what Buddhism may or may not, it's arguable, provides, which is active participation in history, in human history, that the world is not finished, and that we need a kind of prophetic moral foundation, moral values to make the world just, and also they also talk about stop being so damn selfish and let go of the attachment to the ego, just like the Buddhists. So I kind of like putting the two together, as other people do. David Loy, I'm going to show you a quote of his in a minute. And there's Jesus and Buddha taking a selfie together. Okay. I have David Loy later. Okay. Here's an issue that I think is very important to talk about. Again, almost any one of these slides can go on for a long time. I think it's very important to make the distinction between the relative and the absolute. We need to avoid what therapists call spiritual bypass. So in the relative world, that's everyday perception. We kind of self-exist. We relate to a world out there. In the absolute world, which many of us strive for when we practice contemplative practices, mindfulness, meditation, the self gets dissolved, and you experience the world in a more fluid way. And the problem I see often in these lessons is that mindfulness doesn't make this distinction, and they conflate and confuse the two, which leads to this spiritual bypass. Some of you have friends or relatives, they're in need of some immediate help. Like maybe their child there has to be some connection with they have to talk to a social worker, something has to be done. And instead they'll just say, well, God will provide, or that's just the way, heaven is. And this is that's the argument about spiritual bypass. It jumps over the relative world and what needs to be done into God will provide, or some kind of spiritual notion. And so it ignores the social realm. And so you hear these very seductive terms. I think they're be in the moment, be in the here and now, be not do, acceptance of the way things are, and so on. And the argument is I think you have to put the two together. So Ron Person and I have a friend, a Facebook friend. What he did was he took some of those quotes and he did a kind of it's almost a harsh satire. He juxtaposed them with pictures. So the lower right one is the simplest one to look at. That's a Syrian refugee who made her way to Turkey, and she tried to swim from Turkey to Greece. And so if you juxtapose that with this, again, a kind of seductive statement by John Kabat-Zinn, you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. Okay, there's some truth to that. We each apply our own context to that. But when you put them together, hey, you got to wake up to the world too. I mean, that's really the point here. So that's one important thing to do. Here's the quote from David Loy, which I think really sums it up. He's a Buddhist activist. He's a very good scholar. He says the world is perfect just as it is now, and that's a kind of a Buddhist absolute statement. Yes, even if when things are horrible, you feel, well, the world. Can I breathe? Can I just accept things? Yep, that's a feeling. And yet it also calls desperately for radical action. That paradox can't be resolved in an intellectual or rational way, but it can be resolved in what we do, in our practice, and how we actually live our lives. I'm going to skip over his other quote, which is a whole other discussion, but he's very good. Okay, this is another slide that's going to take too long. I'm going to skip over it. This would be a whole other presentation. What I argue for is the need, and other people, including Ken Wilber is very good on this, is the need to look at stages of self-development. So you don't just look at states of mind. You have to look at stages as well. So for example, and I'm going to pass over the, Robert Keegan, who's a developmental psychologist at Harvard, has a good model. There's some other people that have models of self-development. The argument here is that the typical one good example is the Japanese monks during World War II. They could meditate till kingdom come. They could achieve very high states of contemplative awareness. So that was their state. But when they got out of that state, the stage, they were still at an arguably conventional or almost a malignant or toxic stage of conventional thinking, which became a kind of authoritarianism, became a very conformist, authoritarian stage, because they had this total allegiance to the emperor. And of course, many of us know in certain Buddhist traditions, there's a guru who may, again, meditate great, but he often will be a sexual predator. In other words, his stage is very toxically egocentric. And then there are people that also, unfortunately, some follow him, and they may be able to meditate well, but their stage of development is at an earlier stage. So that's the kind of example of that. I could make a whole bunch of points about that. I'm going to skip that. Okay, I'm going to get into now. We're pivoting to the third part. Maya, how are we doing on time?
We've got about 15 minutes left.
15, or
yeah.
Just for me, right? And then hopefully for them too, or
in total. So you can play with that how you'd like. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, we may. I don't know if Carrie and Maya, we may have to go over because this is kind of the heart of it. I knew this would happen. So typical high school mindfulness approach. You want to reduce kids' anxiety or stress. The first three parts we all do. You notice and label your thoughts and emotions when you're mindful. The newer part is in a group dialogue, you identify and investigate those shared thoughts and feelings. And you discuss and analyze how those are socially conditioned beliefs and pressures from society. And you trace their origins to a dominant neoliberal set of values that we often ingest or incorporate through media, school, and peers. I'm going to give you some examples of that in the next slide. But what happens then, with students, you want to be able to rethink the meaning of education and have a less stressful meaning of education. Have people talk about it and explore it and come up with deeper ways of doing that. Yes, here's some examples. This is I don't know the name of this person who came up with this slide, what he calls internalized capitalism. So when we all feel guilty for resting or think that your self-worth is only based on doing well in your career and so on, your productivity before your health, and you're mindful and you're meditating and these thoughts come up. He's saying, hey, these are often things that we've internalized from capitalism, from an outside structure. Let's identify them, not just say, yeah, I'm feeling restless, I'm feeling bored, I'm feeling angry. I mean, no, that's okay. But I'm saying, let's refine it. Let's try to have these kind of categories that we people come together and agree on, and then talk about it. Talk about where are they coming from. That we all share these categories, we all share these feelings, and then give each other support, and then move on from there, which I'm going to talk about. Anger is an important issue. Many people are already talking about this. Again, in schools, it's often just anger management and chill out and self-regulate for classroom management. I'm saying that we need with kids and educators to talk about the social conditions of why you get angry. When is it justified? When is it unskillful and unhelpful? Why is it that some people are allowed to get angry? Like the typical point is about that men are more allowed to get angry, although then they're less allowed to express other feelings that we need to do. And then talk about, what is grown-up anger? What does it mean to be, righteously angry as opposed to self-righteously angry, where you're attached to yourself, you're attached to your own anger. You can think about it developmentally and consider how to implement mindful social action, which I'm going to talk about in a second, with your righteous anger, in terms of being a public school advocate, in terms of being a feminist. Rebecca Tracer talks about anger, Black Lives Matter, LGBTQs, and so on. I'm deliberately skipping over things. Self-care is another typical privatized, individualistic, neoliberal kind of approach that's out there. People make money off selling all kinds of wellness and calming things. But on the other hand, the good news is there's a number of books that critically examine the ideology of individualistic, commodified self-care, because a lot of people have an equitable resource. A lot of people say, hey, I can't afford to do what you're saying I should do, to buy this or to take time out or, take time from work or from my kids and so on. So the idea is to consider self-care with others as a radical social act. It's not simply, yes, we do need to sleep, have adequate sleep and nutrition and exercise, absolutely, but to see it as part of a larger movement. So Audre Lorde has a well-known quote, some of you probably, I'm sure, familiar. Self-care is an act, is a radical act. It's political warfare. Again, if you do it in the context of with other people. So people together in a school or in a context can create and practice alternative models of self-care as more relational and social and inclusive and collaborative. Feminists and activists are doing that. Obviously, with COVID, that it's called for that. Trauma, I won't even get into. That's a whole issue. Again, there are people that are arguing for, instead of a very kind of individualistic adjustment, where you kind of return to a homeostasis of society, instead you're looking at it as part of changing the society, as part of the relationships and structure of society, so that you're healing from trauma by changing the society. I know David Trelevin does some good work around this. There's a number of webinars on trauma, and somebody on Facebook, a group on Facebook, Occupy group, calls it the somatics of social justice in terms of healing trauma in this way. I'm going to skip over that. Attention is a whole other area now that's fortunately getting more feedback. It's people I would love to see people working in a school to critically investigate this, the attention economy, the whole notion of how Silicon Valley has these very clever tricks of getting, clickbaiting and getting you to capture your attention for profit. I know, again, on this series webinar, Beck Tench has done a webinar on attention. And you want to keep asking, why do bored, alienate students need to be taught how to pay attention with mindfulness? What does that say about the schooling? And there are people, of course, doing the negative effects on child and adolescent development in terms of the social media. That's a whole other discussion that I think needs to be included in talking about mindfulness. Why are mindfulness programs aimed at poor African American schools? There's something that again, it's a kind of way of adjusting them and maybe not trusting them. That's a whole discussion. I'm going to keep moving. So we're looking at two things here, and I'm almost at the end. One is looking at the school culture. So there's two things that need to be done with school culture. One is, some people are doing this. You want to create what Olin Gunlaugson calls a we space, which is conscious, caring, empathy, deep listening, a kind of culture in the school. But the second part that we need to do, and Ken Wilber is good on this, we have to identify together and work to change the unspoken, implicit, unhealthy, inequitable norms that are going on kind of in the water that we're not aware of. So there might be, you might learn to be more thoughtful towards somebody, but there's still a kind of norm or rule of competitiveness in the organization of the school, racism, toxic masculinity, authoritarianism, whatever it is. You want to try to root it out, which is threatening to people. It can be threatening and scary, and that's why, again, you have to try to do it in a caring, careful, kind of mindful culture. And so then you can try to imagine and collaborate a more mindful, visionary culture of the school. And again, Jennifer Cannon talks about building on local cultural and community strengths. Kevin Healy talks about using digital media and dreaming together, writing a more empowering cultural narratives through writing, through English, and so on. So that was culture. That's kind of like culture is like in the old days. Now things are hopefully more interdisciplinary, but culture is like anthropology. And now I'm looking at structure, which is more sociology. So two things here again. You want to identify and investigate unjust structures and barriers and policies that are going on in the school. What's really wrong in terms of the policies, and then you want to take skillful, mindful social action together. That could be meeting with the administration, doing a petition, organizing parents or other kids at various levels, right? To challenge the structural inequities. Okay. And again, a quick acknowledgement to two people who are doing some of this work on a more almost interpersonal level, which is Beth Barilla, who's doing not only anti-oppressive and feminist critical pedagogy, she's also doing anti-racist work. I think that's one of her webinars or training sessions, and certainly Rhonda McGee, who's done a lot of good work on racism. The Color Insight is, I think, an earlier book, and she has a new book out on again, using this to try to change not just the consciousness, but trying to change the structure here. Okay, real briefly, I did this work in early 2000s. I worked with a high school football team, and I used mindfulness. The hook with them was to try to be mindful so they could play better football. What I was interested in was trying to get them to move up in terms of their level of development around masculine gender identity. So in other words, a lot of them said the usual tape that a lot of you are familiar with. Yeah, I got to be tough. I can't share my feelings. I can be angry and blah blah blah. So I was trying to use mindfulness to get them to notice and to let go of some of those thoughts when those tapes that arise in their head. But along with that, as a counselor educator, I did a counseling group with them. So we would talk about their issues around not only conventional masculinity, but their relationships with their teammates, with women, with their fathers. And so I would try to link that with the messages they're getting from the society in terms of materialism, in terms of sexism and racism and so on. And the idea was to try to notice that and use that and let them go. So I have a book on that. Finally, this is taken from the other end. This is for people who are already social activists, right? And can mindfulness help you be a better social activist if you're already committed to working on social structure and social culture and so on? So on a personal level, can mindfulness help social activists with, and again, there are people doing this work. This is not even I probably snuck this in. There are people in the Mindful and Social Change Network that are doing this. There's a fellow named James Rowe, R-O-W-E, at the University of Victoria, who does good work on this. Can mindfulness help when we do activism to be less intolerant, to look at harsh judgmentalism, to look at being self-righteous and bullying, to being too attached to our own perspective, to not noticing why are we saying that to the person, and so on. I'm going to jump down to the interpersonal, where maybe there's a disinterest in dialogue, or a little bit we're being dogmatic, what James Rowe talks about is the tendency to have us and them thinking, and is there a way to go beyond that and still be a social activist, and still, we have to still oppose things that we think are wrong, and to pay more attention to the process. So, and there's a quote here from Barack Obama. I'm not going to get into that. That's a kind of controversy. Oh, here's the arrow. Okay. Here's my conclusion. Okay, so I think we need a new mindful deal, and a mindfulness that is mindful or critically conscious of its own position within education and neoliberal society. It connects intrinsically the personal experience and the inner work and self-development with critical awareness of, quote, outside social relations and structure. It insists on their inseparability of both optimal universal development and social justice. It's practiced within and alongside a critical pedagogy that uncovers, interrogates, challenges everyday neoliberalism and so on, all the isms. And it links up with, and this is where we have work to do for the future, it's contributing to hopefully a post-Trump world, a post-pandemic world. We know that's got to happen. And hopefully a post-neoliberal, post-colonial vision, and social movements that move towards equitable democratic institutions and society and toward an inclusive, healing, universal, optimal human development. So that's really my summary. This is a bibliography. It's mostly all about me. What about me? And then this one is a list of books. I'm sorry, I don't have the more detailed references. And also some podcasts and organizations. The Mindful Cranks, which Ron has really been doing a great job on. I sit in occasionally. And Mindfulness and Social Change Organization is a terrific network out of Britain, and it's on Facebook. And then there's Occupy, also on Facebook. So that's really, what have I done? I've gone, exactly an hour. How about that? All right. Well, I'm open to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Great, perfect timing, David. Thank you so much. So I have invited folks to submit questions in the chat box and to stay along with us for a few extra minutes if you can, to have some possibly live Q&A. So for this, if you do have questions that you'd like to speak out loud, you can use the raise hand function, which I believe should be at the bottom of your Zoom control panel screen. And David, if you want to stop sharing your screen, you could possibly see some more faces of the folks that are with us.
So stop share, okay. Wow, let's see, I see you, I see a few people.
Great. So while folks are getting their words together, if they'd like to share, there are some questions in the chat that I'll start off with.
Gallery view, there they are.
Yeah. Someone has asked if you could provide the name of the self-development theory out of Harvard, or the person who was doing the work.
Yeah, that's Robert Keegan. It's called Over Our Heads. This is the book he did. There's a woman named Suzanne Cook Greuter, Greuter, who picked up the work of Jane Lovinger, who was at Washington University of St. Louis, on self-development. So it's Robert Keegan and Suzanne Cook Greuter. And also, if you're into therapy, Mark Foreman has a book that I have on the list who applies the developmental level in terms of helping people in therapy.
Great, thank you. And just to remind everyone who's still on with us, we will be sending the PowerPoint slides to you in the post-event follow-up. So I'm not seeing any hands raised just yet, but I am seeing another question in the chat, which is, how would you recommend starting a conversation about critical social mindfulness with more privileged upper class white students compared to a more diverse or underserved group of students?
I was one of them. They are under a hell of a lot of stress. They get their stress. I mean, many of you know, the bar has been raised to get into elite colleges. Their parents are very nervous about keeping their lifestyle going. The teachers have given them much more homework than when I grew up. So you want to be able to talk about the social sources of their stress and how they internalize that and how hard they are on themselves, the perfectionism and, I got an A- instead of an A, and where is that coming from? And, to again, broaden the lens and look at why is this happening now in the society? I mean, people are very nervous. There's much more of a again, a neoliberal emphasis on selling yourself as a brand, right? You've got to promote yourself. You have to have a curriculum vitae in high school of all the accomplishments and so on. I mean, to look at what's happening historically. And my wife teaches at City College, and the non-tenured professors already have books. I mean, it's like, it wasn't that long ago where you were lucky to have a few peer-reviewed articles. I mean, everything has just been jacked up. So these kids, and then of course, you can talk about again, as a counselor educator, you want to have a group, you want to have counseling. We're talking about competition among each other and how they may snipe with each other, and to be able to really hash it out and talk about it and try to understand and analyze what's happening and try to put a stop to some of this, which are many ways. You might have a parent-student meeting and talk about, have the students talk back to this, not back, but talk to the parents and so on. That's just for starts.
All right, and I am seeing some hands raised. Thank you, Carrie. So I'm going to unmute Camila.
So I see 2 pages here.
Hello.
Hello.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Hello. First, thank you for this webinar. And I just want to say I'm having like a visceral reaction to this webinar. I find it very interesting, especially as a person of color listening in on this. If I am clear on what you're expressing, it's that you feel that mindfulness in schools needs to include this social component. And you mentioned some things. I guess my question to you would be, how would you, I guess, have a conversation around or respond to battle fatigue? When it comes to some of the things you mentioned, I feel like those things have been already taking place in school systems. And I can definitely understand and see your point of view of including that within the mindfulness in schools. But whether you are with a group of students or parents or administrators who may feel like this concept is great, we've kind of been doing it, now we're going to really focus and hone in how we're going to include that into mindfulness. But also, there are people coming from a space where, especially if, people of color, where it feels like we've been knocking on that door for a really long time in terms of dismantling systems, and nothing's happening with that. So, yeah. So I guess my question is more around, if anyone were to present to you this sort of concept around battle fatigue, because it's like, I feel like students could have a conversation around, yes, we can use mindfulness to go to teachers, go to administrators, go to our parents, try to make these changes, try to look at really what's going on with the school, and not, just focusing on the individual, because I completely understand that. Rest, all these things are liberation practices. But to me, it's like, if I'm a student and you're telling me, okay, mindfulness is this practice, is beneficial in these ways. Also, we can use it to dismantle the system and improve things on a more holistic level. But then every time I turn on the TV, there's someone that looks like me who is being shot by the police, who is being, continuously oppressed by a system that is doing exactly what it's been designed to do.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that. I mean, some of the, you can tell me more about what I'm going to say in some ways. I mean, I know that people are just trying to support each other. I mean, with the constant disappointment and constant efforts, and then you see, like you said, nothing happens. My one understanding is that the mindfulness can just help people with support and be with being pissed off, or be with having despair, or being disappointed, or, I mean, that's one thing. I mean, to me, that's at least a valuable place for it. I mean, just in terms of supporting and being with it. The other is just to keep doing. I mean, it's easy for me to say, obviously, but I consider myself an activist, and I'm trying to, in my own life, to just keep doing things, to keep fighting. And, you know, I've learned that from generations of my own family. Just, you know, you can feel despair and you want to give up, and you try to do mindful social action. You try to find ways, and every once in a while, the world surprises you that, you know, you get a little victory, or you get some little change. But I get what you're saying. I mean, I don't want to make this a positivity. I don't want to go the direction of, well, you just do this and you're going to get, you know, you're going to get the results. I mean, there's no question about what your reality and what's happening. So I don't know if that's an answer for you.
Oh, thank you. I think the piece that you spoke on it in regards to community, you know, I think that is a core foundation of how mindfulness can be very helpful. So,
yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to find one other person who has noted that they would like to speak. Just bear with me as I do so. All right, Grace, I am unmuting you.
Let's see, where's Grace?
Thanks, Maya. And I just wanted to thank CMind for hosting this event. And thank you so much, Dr. Forbes, for this presentation. It's very heartening and encouraging to find like-minded people that are doing this work. I'm a senior mental health advisor at a state education agency, and I took this position for the very reason that I think you are doing this work, and that we are living in a time where we have things that we're taking, our educational systems are taking as absolutes, like social emotional learning, mindfulness instruction, and to quote the Bettina Love, so many of these things in our system are like white supremacy with a hug. And we have so many students, you know, LGBTQ students, students of color, tribal students, for whom being told just to breathe or pay attention or just do this or just do that,
yep,
which is completely ignorant of the realities they're living with every single day.
Yep.
It's doing far more damage than good, and it really troubles me. And I'm grateful for this. I'm grateful for your work, and I'm wondering, similar to what Camilla was saying, it feels as though there are many of us that are, you know, in disparate parts of the state, whether it's higher ed, state ed, that are seeing this and speaking to this. But a lot of time, you know, I'm living in a very white supremacist state, and it feels like we're often really alone in the work, and that we need to really continue to have and host conversations around this issue, because as long as we are, and I won't say silent because I'm hardly silent, but as long as we are continuing to not join forces and align our voices and also elevate the voices of our communities, we're continuing to do harm. And I'm just wondering, because it seems like you're further downstream than I am, what are you doing, or what can we do as a collective to really elevate this conversation and bring it to light? Because I saw that Mindful Schools video, and I mean, I was so angry. And this is what kids see every single day. And our field needs to take responsibility for this and do something to dismantle these systems that are so harmful. So anyway, the question is, what can we do together to change this reality for our kids and for our communities?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, part of it is for those of us here who feel like-minded to keep networking and talking. So I want to do a shout out here to Carolyn Barrett, who's in England. She's right. You're in England right now. Yeah, she is. She's part of the Mindfulness and Social Change. Is it called Mindfulness and Social Change Network? But so join that network. I mean, they're doing things, but Carolyn also has a blog, and she's been doing activism in her community. But the point is that we need to all come together and talk to each other and network. And keep trying to find like-minded people. I've often felt like a voice in the wilderness too. What am I missing? What else do you really want to hear?
Well, I agree, and I think it's even bigger than mindfulness. I think the whole, the system. It's not just mindfulness; it's social emotional learning, it's trauma and care.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole system in education is just reinforcing this narrative that people are broken and need to be fixed over and over again. So yes, I agree. Networking, super important. And I think it's bigger than the space that mindfulness occupies.
Yeah. Let me hear from Dr. Jennifer Cannon, who has something to say.
Congratulations, Dr. Cannon.
Thank you so much, you all. Thank you. I am not used to that name. My daughter's been calling me Dr. Mommy for the last 2 days. David, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. You are brilliant. And David has been a foundational mentor for me in my doctoral studies and in my work. I always learn so much from you, David. And I really admire your integrity, and you've really stuck with this. I just wanted to add to this last part of the conversation about what we can be doing to elevate this conversation. And I agree with what's just been said, that we need to have more of these forums and dialogues talking about critical social mindfulness, liberatory mindfulness, radical mindfulness, revolutionary mindfulness, transformative mindfulness, mindfulness for social justice, right? There's so many different names that we have for it now, but it's about the ideology that we share of revolution and radical change and liberation and freedom and justice. And so whatever we call it, it's more about us coming together with those shared values and elevating that new discourse around mindfulness and continuing to call out the colonial dynamics that we see present in the mindfulness field, where Asian voices and Asian American voices are silenced. Indigenous mindfulness activists and educators are silenced, and many other people of color who are very active in the mindfulness movement, their voices are erased and silenced. So as you know, what's one thing that white folks can do is figure out where to spend your money, not doing very expensive certifications and attending expensive conferences, and really think critically about who we're supporting in the mindfulness field, and boycotting conferences that are elitist and promote a neoliberal agenda, and boycotting conferences that don't have people of color or queer folks or women on the conference panels and as keynote speakers. Just say, nope, I'm not going to go. And then also send a note to the conference organizers and let them know why you're boycotting, and publish about it, write why you're boycotting. And finally, I think I just want to say, listening to our brothers and sisters and trans and queer folks of color who are leading the way with liberatory mindfulness, and that's in the crossover in the Buddhist Dharma communities, and also in secular mindfulness communities, but that are really talking about creating a new mindfulness for liberation, not for health and well-being. And all these things that David so beautifully laid out for us about social control and productivity. But a new vision for mindfulness. It's so exciting. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. Good to see you.
You too.
I apologize. Someone had submitted something much earlier on and it was backlogged. So I just want to share from Kirsten, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. She said, I feel more confident about contemplative practices as a result of the quote unquote reality check issues presented in this talk.
Yes, thank you. I see Carolyn had raised her hand.
Yes, yeah. I just wanted to share that. And Carolyn, I am unmuting you.
Hear me? Great. I'm involved in an amazing anti-racism project within my department. And we're doing some great work on a very practical level, which feels brilliant. I feel very nervous about bringing mindfulness into the conversation because of some of this critique. And so I wondered about your tips for bringing mindfulness into those kind of conversations in a way that won't be seen as kind of trying to wash over the issues, which are actually being dealt with in a very practical way.
So you're saying what would be the tips to bring some of this perspective into people that are already doing mindfulness in your agency? No,
the anti-racism work is ongoing, which
is multi-racism, okay,
and it's really great, but mindfulness isn't part of the dialogue.
Okay, how to bring the mindfulness part. Yeah, I mean that's almost the last slide in terms of, you know, how to. It's almost emotional or counseling in terms of how are we processing what's happening between us? What are we feeling? Do we get impatient? Do we get judgmental? Are we paying attention to how we're treating each other? Do we think, you know, a typical mindfulness practice is always when somebody's speaking, you're not listening because you're already thinking about what you're going to say. Basically, I don't know if that's addressing what you're saying, but basic, non-threatening kinds of practices that are, you know, useful in facilitating how to be better at what they're doing. I know that Paula Haddock works at some of that stuff. So in England, I don't know if that helps a little bit. Okay.
I do see one more hand raised. And for those who are still here, I assume you can stay a few more minutes, but if you have to leave, we won't take it personally. So Kathleen, I'm going to unmute you.
Thank you. I just wanted to mention that I've had some experience working with relational mindfulness practice that implements Donna Hicks' elements of dignity beautifully, that does not use mindfulness in its title. It uses the concepts of pause, relax, open, attune to emergence, listen deeply and speak the truth. It's from Insight Dialogue, but I'm interested in using that in a secular context. And I've actually been in a dialogue group with the gentleman who sat next to me and told me that he knew Martin Luther King had been discriminated against all of his life. And what he believed is we need to really open and talk to each other. And what this dialogue practice does is you're speaking separately about what's arising in the moment for you. And it allows you to look internally at your stories that you're coming from, which I think is critical to do that and to share that in a way where there's not judgment, because all you're doing is looking at new insights. And I actually had the experience of talking as a person of color in a dyad dialogue and suddenly being aware of the incredible amount of energy it takes to deal with microaggressions and all of that stuff. It turned me around completely because I could see it in myself. Yeah. So I think listening, but also being in dialogue, respectful, dignified dialogue is critical to all of this. I just wanted to mention that seems to be one opening for this. And I think teens and other people, if it's correctly facilitated, would really like to be heard, you know? We all like that.
Yes, thank you. That's great. That's really a great contribution. Yes.
Okay. Oh, we got one more hand raised here.
Hi, thank you
Oh, there you are.
for your very interesting talk. I am actually at San Francisco State University, but I've never met Ron. And I'm actually teaching a meditation course there. And the students, 2/3 of the students are students of color. A lot of them are first generation. And or Pell eligible, and I see this in like so much stress that they're often working full-time jobs and trying to go to school full-time, and now with the pandemic, and I'm thinking a lot about these issues, and at the same time I just wonder, like adding in this social, political perspective with them. I just wonder kind of what Camila was saying about the battle fatigue, I'm just wondering kind of how to balance that with them, to give them some kind of like relief from all of it, to give them some relief, from all of the pressures of our society without then putting on, and I'm just wondering if it's just a little much as they're learning, so I'm just kind of thinking about this trajectory and how to introduce these ideas, and just wondering if you have any thoughts.
I think what you and Camila said is crucial. I think we have to build in that support and that the caring and the listening and the speaking with each other. I think that's absolutely crucial. I mean, if we don't, I mean, right now we're in a crisis, and I know that I have some familiarity with those kinds of students. It is like almost every day is a kind of a trauma, and so they need a lot of peer support and adult or professor support in those ways. Your question is a good one in terms of how do you, it's case by case. How do you balance that with raising critical questions so that people don't feel self-blame? I mean, again, that's part of the problem. They feel burnt out, and so they blame themselves or they feel bad themselves. So that, counseling one-on-one is to put people in a group and to say, well, who else feels that way? Of course. So, and then you bring in the mindfulness practices and skills, so that can add to that. And then you bring in some kind of critical pedagogy that says, well, why are we all feeling this way? Let's look at that. So you can kind of build on that. But I think you're right to be concerned about the balance of that, and to certainly have compassion for what these students are going through.
Yeah. Thank you. And just kind of a follow-up question, I've started talking about self-compassion with them, which is kind of like the cousin of mindfulness in some ways. And, it's a pandemic in itself, the self-blame that you're talking about, and linking that to the neoliberal framework, I think is interesting. And I think maybe I need a couple more links to really kind of see why is it that we're always blaming ourselves,
The folks in power love it. They love to divide and conquer. They want us to blame ourselves so that we don't have to have a public space. We don't have to put money into public care, for education, for healthcare. I mean, it's everything's, if you feel responsible and you feel guilty, and then you have to buy what they want to sell. And so, I mean, but you're right, that's a whole discussion of making those links between this kind of social structure and how we tend to feel about ourselves.
Yeah, how we internalize the process is interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure, you're welcome.
So I'll just pause for a moment and let anyone else who's still here, if you are wanting to share anything, but I'm not seeing anything. So David, thank you for staying an extra almost 30 minutes. I think that was great and definitely needed, and having a live Q&A is really special. So thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for sharing all of your work with us. Thank you all for staying on and hanging in with us. Just a quick reminder, we did record this, so we'll be sending out a link to that shortly, along with the PowerPoint, which has all of David's resources. That's a great list. I'm sure we'll all be referring to that. And I think that's it. So thank you all. Be well. Have a wonderful weekend. And I hope we'll see you soon.
Thanks to everyone. Thanks very much.